What up, friends?
What
What up, people? Welcome to Counterculture Conversations with the homies. Hey. And we are, the two of us, our counterculture educator. I am DW, pronouns they, them.
I'm Kinga, pronouns she, her.
And we invited one of the homies, which is Naimah. We know the homie as Naimah, but we're going to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. But Naimah is coming from Minnesota to talk to us about
Naimah Petigny. I grew up in Amherst with Kinga more so as youngins and have gotten to know DW much more later in life. Currently, I'm coming to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I am a PhD candidate in gender, women, sexuality studies at the University of Minnesota. I also work as an independent researcher, and yeah, it's been a hot summer here in Minneapolis, and it's been important for me to get to connect with the two of you and talk about what's going on, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, and learn from each other.
For sure. Word. So maybe we should give y'all the skinny on what we do as counterculture educators, because I didn't say that, right? So we help creative leaders turn around the culture of their communities one authentic relationship at a time. And we do that through community engagement practices, artistic expression, self-care, and play. And so we wanted to invite you to have the conversation. So for people who are creative leaders that are learning from us, to kind of build value and understanding of what it is and the ways that they can be with the people that they are teaching or leading or choosing to lead and be around in their communities.
Absolutely. Right? That's
huge. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say it's huge, just giving people the tools they need to do the work that they're called to do. And, you know, as educators, we know how important language is. We know how important it is to make sure the people you're speaking to can hear you.
Right.
And yeah.
Word. And I just want to mention, like, when we talk about educators, like repurposing that as well. So that's why we say creative leaders. Yeah. And when we think about educators, I think we only think about people in institutions.
Right.
And so how do we repurpose that and talk about coaches who are leading young people, parents who have children? We're talking about people in your everyday lives. Like, you could be a restaurant owner and you are responsible for people. And what kind of cultures are you presenting, and what kind of cultures are you bringing? And how can we be informed about the kind of culture that we are bringing, right? And so that's why we had the conversation briefly on the phone, and I was like, wow, we've got to talk about this more extensively.
Yeah,
and around gender and sexuality, and how our identities intersect. Mm-hmm. So I just want to pop it off, and Kinga, like, you're good for some great conversation. So I want to pop it off because I know for some of the folks, just even having a understanding, what is it? So when we say cis, like cis male, cis woman, like understanding gender. Right? Yeah. Maybe if we just start with gender and then maybe we move to sexuality, right? But just, can you give us an understanding of what we need to know when we're in conversation, and things that we can be talking about in a way where we're not harming people, but we're being aware and we're using the spirit of inquiry?
Yeah, absolutely. Should I just dive right in?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so one of the first things I would say is that everywhere we look, when we look on our IDs, when we look at signs that are on bathrooms, when we look on employment forms, we usually see two genders represented, right? Male and female. Mm-hmm. And that right there is our first clue that we live in something that is called a gender binary world, right? A world where we are told and systems recognize only two genders, right? Male and female, people who identify as women and people who identify as men. And it's important for us to understand that gender and sexuality are always more expansive, meaning they always have more definitions, they always look like more things, they always mean more things to people than systems will tell us, right? So when you're only given two boxes to check, how we can understand that is the system only understands that there are two genders. Right. When we know that the diversity of experiences on this planet at this moment across time represent a much, much, much more broader and diverse way to think about gender and sexuality in the first place. Mm-hmm. So kind of speaking about the term cisgender, right? So the term cisgender refers to someone who identifies with the gender that they were assigned at birth. And so at birth, right, doctors look at babies and make a decision about what gender they are. When I say it like that, it sounds kind of arbitrary, right? And it's because it is. It's an arbitrary decision that doctors make, whether someone's genitalia looks female to them or male to them, right? That is a determination that someone makes, right? That's a decision someone makes, right? About your gender identity. And I was assigned female at birth. I identify as a woman throughout my life, still identify as a woman, use she, her, hers, and I'm cisgendered, right? The gender identity I was assigned at birth, female, is the gender identity that I continue to live with in the world. So people who identify as trans women, trans men, are people who identify with a different gender than they were assigned at birth, right? So trans women are people who were assigned male at birth who identify as women and who have always known they are women. And what it is that we look at is systems, right? Their ID is, you don't get to define kind of what your gender looks like on your ID without going through an extremely lengthy and expensive process, right? And many trans activists and writers, folks have told us what that means, that you have to go through a legal process to have yourself represented on your ID. So people who identify with, who embody a gender that is different than the one assigned to them at birth, identify as transgender, right? And thinking with what we know, which is that gender is variant, gender is expansive, gender is, again, much bigger than the systems and the languages that we think we have to understand it. A term that people will say is new is gender queer or gender non-conforming.
Uh-huh.
Right. But history will tell us, trans elder activists will tell us, young trans folks will tell us, right, that people have always existed in gender variant ways. Yeah. And a lot of those people have been Black and brown. So,
right. Okay.
Right. And so even the idea of someone saying that they are non-binary means that they understand their gender outside of the binary system of male gender and female gender. And so, you know, non-binary can look like a million other things, right? People can identify, people can present in a whole type of ways. And what non-binary is about is thinking about disrupting abolition. I'll talk about abolition, right? Abolishing the gender binary, which says there is only two genders. We will only recognize two genders.
Right.
You have two options of which boxes you want to check.
Right.
That type of binary logic would tell us that there is no such thing, right, as a gender variant, a gender queer, or a gender non-conforming person.
So then what exactly is the gender part? Because when I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, okay, so there's these two boxes, these two options, and then we break that, and now everything is everywhere and it's up for grabs. But what is that, like, what are the characteristics that, you know, because in our society, you know, to be a woman is what you were assigned with at birth. To be a cis woman is what I was assigned with at birth, right? The doctor looked at me, identified me as being female, and that's how I identify. So I'm a cis woman. Mm-hmm. But I also subscribe to a lot of, like, I have a lot of the qualities and interests that go in what society deems as being a woman, you know? Mm-hmm. And so, and then there's, you know, there's the same for being male. And I guess I wonder, I'm curious about, like, what does that stuff mean? And where is the gender part of it?
Absolutely. I think what's so great about that question is that it tells us that, like, we're talking about a whole bunch of things, right? We're talking about legal identification, right? So something about what your ID says, what you were assigned at birth. Then we're talking about how you personally identify, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking about the different traits that you have, right? How you consider yourself. Mm-hmm. Do you identify as being more femme? Do you identify as being more butch? And that is connected to gender. But of course, you know, there's not one way to be butch, there's not one way to be femme, and those don't automatically correlate to specific genders, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So there's many ways. So just because someone is a cis woman, and there are two cis women in a room, the two of them can embody what being a woman means in widely different ways, right? And so that's why our gender performance, how we exist, embody our gender, how we talk about our gender, what we wear, how we talk about what we wear corresponds to our gender, right? For some people, that's really important. For other people, what they wear is not the most important marker of who they are and how they present themselves.
Right.
All those elements, you know, come to make up how it is that we present ourselves. And, you know, I think obviously related is your sexual identity, right? Whether you identify as queer, whether you identify as bisexual, pansexual, heterosexual, and not the same thing, right, as gender, but of course a whole other set of spectrums and ways that people identify.
So let me pause right there. You have some, because I have some.
Well, I want to clear. I have a clarifying question.
Yeah, of course.
So we're talking about there is the gender, which is what you were assigned with, and it has to do.
Well, gender is assigned, but your gender, how you identify. So you
how
can
you identify.
Yeah,
But then there's the gender expression.
Hold on, we're both talking.
Oh, I was gonna say, but then there's like the gender expression that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And that's separate from the actual gender.
No, it could be together, but I'm just saying that there is, so people name what their gender is, and that gender may be what is prescribed to them, but also may not be, right? And that doesn't, just because it wasn't the gender that was subscribed to you doesn't mean that it's any less part of someone's gender performance.
Right. So I'm thinking about it on like, as in terms of me, because there's so much confusion. Like even in myself, like I think about how I present in the world and like how the world wants me to present to the world, if that makes sense.
Right. Yes.
Right? And so me being like, okay, I don't identify as extremely male or female. Like it's not something that I identify as existing. And so whatever feels good for me is what is, right?
Yeah.
So.
And I'd say that really is like a real fundamental truth that I hold true. That is definitely something that in the field of gender, women, sexuality studies, we work from the belief that we give people the space to identify who they are and how they want to exist in the world. And for many people, the narrow confines of gender do not give them space to be who they are, right? I mean, there has not been enough space, for example, in womanhood, as it's been traditionally defined, for Black women who are cis. So imagine, right, Black trans women, right? And so the gender in and of itself is often one repertoire that we have to understand who we are and how we present ourselves to the world. And it's often much more limited than the language we have for ourselves around who we are and how we want to be.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. We're actually having the conversation about the limitations of language, and even like having kids in 20 years from now using certain words, and our kids being like, what are you saying? Oh my gosh.
Literally.
You know, like my parents are just, they don't know what they're talking about.
They're so ignorant.
and then having that moment, living in that moment of being like, oh, we are now the parents. Right. Yeah. So, but like, so my thought too is also when we talk about pronouns, right?
Yeah, talk about pronouns.
I also want to talk about pronouns and Blackness, because y'all, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk, where the camera at? We're going to talk
so much.
Right. So, but just really thinking about pronouns, and even when I think about they, them, you know, and what that means for me as I'm moving in the world, and how it seems as though the stigma is that I have to be and exist in a certain way, and that if I change my mind, then that is problematic.
Ooh, right? Say that again.
Okay, I'm gonna try to remember.
Yeah.
So just meaning that I want to be and I want to exist. And so in having the power to change my mind shouldn't be a problematic thing, right? So even like today, they, them, and I've often explored this of like the they, them, the he, him, his, she, her, hers. And that's been a point of exploration for me, because I know that my energy is taken different ways depending on how I express, right? So some people may have even mistaken me for, like, have even mistaken or been said to me, oh, sir, or him, or, you know, so
Mhm.
based off of the way that I'm just
Being, yep.
the way that I'm being, right?
Yeah.
So I understand that the way that I am is the embodiment of all of these different expressions,
Well
right?
said.
So for me, they, them is starting to feel more comfortable for me, and understanding that the transition from she, her, hers, and what that means, and, you know, do I feel comfortable being called hey sis versus hey fam? So these are all things
Right.
that I'm working on transition, and then wanting to also having conversations with people who don't understand this has been a point of contention,
Mm,
and also a point of confusion for me. So
yeah.
just really breaking down an understanding of pronoun, and just having you kind of say, what do we need to know about pronouns? What do you
Yeah.
think that people are often mistaken of, or
Ooh,
the
yeah.
misconception about pronoun is, right?
Ooh, okay. The first one's a little snappy. Okay. So the first one is assuming that you need to know and understand everybody's pronouns.
Mhm.
You don't, right? People will tell you their pronouns and you should use the pronouns that they told you, but you don't need to inquire about why people are you know, in some ways. And what we need to think about, right, is particularly how this is used by white folks, right? So how this becomes another way that white people police other people of color. Because I think it gets hard for genderqueer people of color to say this in white dominated spaces, particularly when there are white non-binary and trans folks there who are not aware of their whiteness, because it can turn into a policing thing. It really has. It's actually been interesting. In my department, we have a lot of conversations around how, you know, should we mandate people sharing their pronouns? What do you do when people don't want to be called by their pronouns? They want to be called by their name, which is a lot of choices that people make. And then most importantly, and this is one of my favorite things that I've learned from one of my good friends, Cheyenne Bhattacharya, who's in my department and is home in Calcutta right now. I miss him so much. Who's also a scholar of gender and sexuality, particularly a trans studies scholar, amazing, is that, you know, not all languages are gendered in the same way that English is.
Right.
And so, right, there are so many brown and black, trans, queer, genderqueer folks who say, like, in my language, it's not gendered in the same way. And so, you know, what I love is that I have so many brown trans folks in my life who understand their transness outside of the binary of English, which is one, like how we're learn about all language, but even to think that I have learned about gender variance and gender queerness through a very gender binary language. Like, isn't that wild?
Yeah.
And so, you know, I always like to share that with people, because, you know, it's important for us to realize that English is such a colonial language and is inherently binary. And that is not true with a lot of other languages spoken, which for me opens up the conversation in a whole other way, right? It's really hard to use English and to talk in certain terms without realizing how much is gendered. The other thing I will say is that, there are a lot of people who don't like pronouns, right? These people are cis, these people are trans, they just call me by my name. And so for many people, that's an option. And I've been in workshops where people have resisted saying what their pronouns are, and people don't like that because now it's kind of like an assumed thing. And so I say that just to open us up to the idea that, you know, there's stuff beyond just saying what your pronouns are at the beginning of the space and feeling like that's enough for people to see who you are. There are many people, cis, trans, gender, queer, who make a lot of other decisions around pronouns that really kind of broaden this conversation. The other thing I would say is, oftentimes, you know, the conversation will say, okay, can you share your pronouns? And people will say she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs. And so those, you know, for people listening, are pretty common ones. ZE is another one that I come in contact with a lot. And, you know, these pronouns are essentially like the terms you use to refer to people if you're not going to use their name. And so a good rule of thumb that I use is, like, if someone doesn't tell me their pronoun, I will just use they. It's easy when I think about it, and it's easy when I don't intentionally decide to gender people whose genders I have no idea about, right? And so if you think about why is it easy? Okay, well, what's easier is your assumption that the person in front of you is the gender that you think they are. And if you don't know, We could just use they, right?
Yes. So that's right. Go ahead, talk about it.
Yeah, I've been, oh my gosh, I love that point, because I remember when we were having a conversation, me and DW, another time, I was saying to them, because somebody said to me when I told them that DW's pronouns were they, them, and they were misusing their pronouns.
Misgendering them? Mm-hmm.
Yes, misgendering them. Thank you. And then they said, of course, wow, well, that's just so difficult because it's confusing. You know, it's when you say they, it's like multiple people. But then I was saying, but if you were referring to someone and you didn't know whether they were a woman or a man.
That person on the bus stop, what is that person doing?
I don't know what they're doing. Yes, exactly. Yes. So like, can we actually take a moment and just recognize that it's not a new thing to use they to refer to other people instead of only using these gendered pronouns? You know, I think that that's an important piece here.
I mean, it is raining. We're going to have to close some.
And it's also interesting because in many ways, you know.
Hold on a second. Oh, yeah. It just started to rain real heavy.
Ooh.
Can you hear it?
No, I can't, but I believe it. New York is supposed to get a storm too. What I was going to say is like, I think it forces, and this is what I will say is I have heard other trans scholars of color in my circle say this, and other trans educators really acknowledge this, is like it forces, you know, their students, if they are gender nonconforming, to say that they're gender nonconforming, which might not be what the student wants to do, especially in that educational context.
Yep.
I work at a predominantly white institution, and I would never profess to say any spaces are safe for my gender person, right? And so, you know, it's just important for us to realize that, yes, you know, check in about pronouns, but to pay attention to how it gets institutionalized, knowing A, that not everybody has gendered pronouns in their language, and B, that not all folks ascribe to normative ways that we think about gender, even in a non-binary space, right? So now we're more comfortable with the idea and the fact that non-binary folks have always existed, that gender is non-binary. And so, you know, as we've seen with other things, when there's an awareness of visibility, it can get institutionalized in very particular ways. Mm-hmm. And most importantly, kind of one of the first things that we want to remember is that gender is expansive, so expansive. Our embodiments of gender, how we live our expressions, are expansive, and always will exceed the structures and the systems that we try and use to categorize and control them.
Yeah.
Just for translate in my mind, what I'm hearing you say is that gender is not anything that we would define it to be. So stop essentially trying to define something that cannot be defined, because it will always be redefined.
Yes, and it is at every moment. And this is why it's such a great question when you ask people about how they understand their gender. Because many times people will say, oh, maybe I've actually never thought about my gender. And when you think about all the elements that are for you connected to your gender, it's so expansive, expansive. Absolutely.
So, I mean, do you have something? Because I want to ask.
Well, I was going to say, because I think that what some people have a hard time with is that, you know, again, going back to these two genders that we've known for so long. And so you have the one, and then you have the other, and now we have everything else. But what we're saying is that it's really more of a spectrum, and that people can land anywhere in between. And I think that that's where, like, it's almost like there's like gates at the other ends, where it's like people want you to be able to then go into the section of this gender, and that this in between is its own gender, but there is no gates. It's one whole fluid spectrum.
Exactly. Yep. And I think in what you said, there's a bunch of really important things. The first one that comes to mind is that people are interested in policing your gender.
Yes.
I think we have to always remember happens in all these small ways, and then in all these massive, massive, massive ways. including but not limited to the harassment and murder of Black trans women, right? And so that is a form of gender policing, right? When you are so concerned when you are concerned with policing someone and how they live their lives, right? A lot of violence is done under the rubric of policing who people are and what their gender is.
But could you give like an example of a non-physical and maybe not even as it's a violent act, but not seen as violent to maybe most people?
Absolutely.
Of how somebody polices gender, because I think that's what that's working with. Yeah.
Yep. So when you think about in communities of color, men of color, Black men particularly, right, who sag their pants, whose aesthetic choice, and I'm always someone who like, I always think about aesthetics as connected to a politic, right? We always think people dress that way just cause like, no, people have a politic to how they look. Like it's a choice, right? Yeah. And so, and this comes from some Black feminist work. I can look up where before, but these are Black feminists who are making these connections for me too, is that we think about people sagging their pants as an element of gender performance, right? That is one way that someone who identifies as a Black man, we can say, cis or trans, right, identifies. Part of how they perform their gender is the sagging of their pants, is how they wear their pants, where their pants fall, where their t-shirt falls, where their shoes fall, all of it, right? All of these elements. Dress is an element of gender performance. And yet, right, because these people are Black and brown, we often don't afford them the space to have a gender performance that is variant. But you know, in many ways, we can identify that sagging pants is in many ways deviant from professional suit and tie wear, which we have been socialized into understanding as how men dress, right? Layers in that, of course, but there's an assumption about what you should dress like when you're a man. And there is something about manhood and womanhood, right, that has been denied for Black people because we are Black. There's a way in which our Blackness is denied humanity, and we are never neatly able to fit into these categories of manhood and womanhood. And so, of course, right, we could never think about how expansive something like sagging your pants actually is. It's a gender performance, right? People choose to do that. And that is a gender expression as much as wearing makeup, wearing heels is. And oftentimes, right, we don't think about Black men as having gendered expressions. Or when we do, it's instantly criminalized or turned into something else, right? So people can understand like a visual element of someone sagging pants, right? And people will instantly connect that to criminality, to deviance, to people will connect it to all types of things, right? That have to do with anti-Blackness. But when do we look at that and think about it as a part of gender performance?
But you know what? Not until this moment. And I think this is important for me to hold myself accountable to, right? So the being in institutions and then me immediately associating, like, so the way that I myself have been trapped in the idea of the violent nature of whiteness and how it has been pervasive within our bodies.
Yes.
Right? And how, when I think about the ways that I've had this conversation back and forth, and me being unsettled about, I really don't want to see your underwear right now, right? Like, I just, like, that's not an experience that I want to have, right? And so, and in thinking about it as gender expression, and then being able to say, okay, how do I reconcile these things, you know, being in spaces where it's like, I don't want to tell you how to be in your body because I wouldn't want you to do that to me. Right. And then also, at what point do I say, like, I'm uncomfortable, and do I have that conversation with you? But why is that? Why am I uncomfortable? Right. So like, it's all these questions that I'm now asking myself of, like, why is that uncomfortable? What is it about it that's uncomfortable for me? Is there an association that I'm having that I haven't yet connected with in my mind, just as a person? And what does that mean in institutionalized spaces? And what does that mean when we are trying to move in a society that is telling us we have to be this way because what whiteness has deemed the way of being?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually, this is such a good conversation. I think a whole nother one that we should talk about, especially as people who've worked in schools, is to think about gender and dress codes, right? Because even when we think about the dress codes for girls in high school, and how they're based on very Western white body standards, even, like the fact that you could give a measurement for a skirt and assume that it would hit everybody at the same place on their thigh is hilarious.
Yes, because we know we have some shapes.
Right. Yes. And we know routinely whose bodies get policed.
Yes.
Who gets expelled.
Yeah.
Right? Who gets penalized. And I mean, there have literally been studies done where Black girls and white girls will wear the same thing to school, right? People have done those experiments. Mm-hmm. There's been amazing ethnographic work where scholars will interview Black girls who've been criminalized and disciplined in schools, and they will talk about how much of that discipline they received related to their body and what they looked like and how they embodied it.
Yes.
But meanwhile, not having a conversation about rape culture in high school. So isn't that interesting, right?
Yes. All of that.
Yes.
All
okay.
That. Yes.
Okay.
But it's true. Like, I think that as educators, I mean, in many ways, right? Around language, around how we speak as Black folks in education spaces, around when teachers feel the need to correct us on how we talk without acknowledging that African-American vernacular is a fucking language.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Mm-hmm. It's a language.
Yes.
So much of our policing of people, I think, is totally related to gender, right? This is why when we say gender-based violence, we can be talking about so many more things than we think gender-based violence, right? Gender-based violence is the over-punishing and over-expelling of Black girls, right? Gender-based violence is the tracking of and the push to get young Black men on medication without talking with their families, right? That is gender-based violence, right? School dress codes are gender-based violence. Like, there's a lot of ways that when we start to understand gender and race as connected, that we can start to look at, okay, it's not always so easy to separate the discrimination I'm facing and how I'm facing that as both a woman and a Black woman. Yes. Often also, right, as a young poor Black student, that's a whole nother level. But again, kind of coming back to this conversation, it allows us to think about how things are much more intersectional, right? We are not single issue people. We don't live single issue lives. And the more that we can understand that nuance and that variance is part of all of our life experiences, then it starts to feel how ridiculous a binary really is, right? Like, we start to realize how unhelpful it is outside of being racist and all that stuff. It's not a helpful tool for understanding the diversity that actually exists in social life.
Yes.
Whew.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm gonna go ahead and myself.
I know.
With a word today. With a
Thinking
word on
so
today.
Many thoughts right now.
So I mean, I don't there's a lot of information. I also want to just be, mindful that we can have many other discussions. It just got deep real quick.
It really did. Yeah. And I love everything that came out of that conversation. I feel like this is a really good place for us to pause right now and come back to in another conversation. And I love to touch on that and more.
Right, because even Blackness and gender and even the exploration.
We have a whole
gender and sexual identity and sexuality and Blackness and even what that means to walk into a space culturally, in our culture, and to be harmed automatically because people have made decisions. They've made decisions, or even just talking about my experience when I've expressed that what allows me to feel seen, and people knowing that, specifically Black people, knowing that I've told you this lights me up. I feel seen when I am seen in this way, right? Or so when I'm asking you to make sure that you are using my pronouns and not investigating my sexuality,
Mhm.
right? And so like investigating my sexuality, right? As if it's your business.
Right.
So right down to my name, right? And how people have this expectation that I'm gonna call you what your mama called you. I'm gonna, like, and how that is violent, violent in itself, and in us not accepting that, especially in our Blackness, not accepting that what somebody is asking, especially if they're younger, right? As well, like this intergenerational thing. Being younger and requesting for you not to be harmed, knowing that we go in the world and are harmed on a regular basis. So to be in our community and not have the expectation of being harmed is almost like, for me, I am not even prepared to go into my community in many spaces because I know that I'm going to be harmed based off of my gender expression.
And it's like, it's really, really deep. And I think that anybody is kidding themselves if they don't think that this is the work of Black liberation, which is getting our folks fucking together so that we can realize how much our lives is limited by the system of white supremacy, and how much more of ourselves we have to be and to live when we start relating to each other and to resources and to space in a completely different way. Because I think we have to address this, right? This is the urgent work of Black liberation, right? The consistent murder of trans women of color, of Black trans women is some of the central work we need to be doing around Black liberation. And for us to have those conversations, right, we have to interrogate this. I'll call you what your mama called you. That shit is for white people.
Right.
Yes. My house. All of this is or wait, just like, right, the work, it's so much work to understand how we internalize anti-Blackness. But we have to know that we absolutely do. I have absolutely encountered anti-Black violence from other Black people. And what does that say, right? That is, that's central. That's not an aside to the work that is the work.
Yes.
I think that, this is something that I confront every time that I try and teach about US social movements, and Black US social movements, is needing people to understand that the institution of slavery was a gendered and racialized economy, right? So it's and so that's why when people say that rape was a tool of slavery, that's what they mean. It was an economic tool. And if we don't understand what gender had to do with slavery, then we will be missing the tools we need to understand what gender and Blackness mean in this contemporary moment.
Yes, that is so potent right there.
It also, on some other shit,
yes,
it also something that I learned this past year that has really affected me is that 56% of slave owners were white women. So when we think about that, right, when we think about plantations,
why is that not surprising?
Why is that not surprising? And plantations are economies, right? It's not run by one sole slave owner. No, it's a family business. In fact, it's to run a plantation, it's an intimate family business.
Absolutely right.
As a central tool that keeps the production running.
You're absolutely right.
And it's important that we understand it, because it also allows us to think about gender across historical periods, which is important to understand why gender means what it means in 2020.
Yeah, and just in addition to that, I think that part of why it's so important to look at anti-Blackness and white supremacy is because within this context is because we have to look at the way that everybody who benefits at all from white supremacy but is bought into that system. And so as you start to go, down the chain, to the lowest of the low of who is at the bottom of our society, which is often Black women, especially Black queer women.
Deeper complected.
Deeper complected. Yeah, let's add that. Every identity that comes and intersectionality that comes before that is benefiting from this system one way or another because it creates this system. So when you have just a little bit more power, then you are playing into the role of oppressing those who are quote unquote beneath you. And that is exactly why we're so bought into the system, because everybody is taking the little piece that they can and they're holding on to it for dear life. And when you talk about gender within slavery, it's the same thing, because that's where we start to see when we would have violence, domestic violence inside of the families in the Black community, because there was needed to be an outlet, right? That was the only person that you could come home to and put all your anger out on. And these are the ways that we're still buying into this system because of the different little pieces that you get to hold on to, and this is what you benefit from, and you forget how it's harming everybody that you're not.
One of the central tenets of my Black feminism, which is an exact tenet of the Combahee River Collective, which was a Black feminist organization that formed in the 70s in the wake of the murder of 9 Black women in Boston in a span of 3 weeks, I want to say. Is that one of their major things is we don't mess people over in the means of politics, right? The ends do not justify the means, right? It matters how we go about our work.
Yes.
Whether that work is organizing a food bank, whether that work is the long haul of Black liberation, is that it matters how we go about our shit. And Black women have been telling us this for decades, and not just telling us this, but embodying the work of doing the work as the practice of liberation. And it really is, Kinga, as you said it, it starts with people realizing, how are you benefiting?
Yeah.
What are you willing to give up? Because you will have to give something up in order for all of this to crumble. We will all be giving shit up, right? And it's hard. That question is hard. How have we individually internalized anti-Blackness in so many ways?
Right.
And it takes almost just as much effort to name it out there as it does to think about where it lives.
Even more, I would say, because at the same time you're dealing with all of the pain and the oppression that you've been experiencing, all the silence that you've been experiencing, all the violence you've experienced, and you want to hold space for that, and then at the same time you have to pull out, how am I contributing to this? I mean, I actually just did a video a couple of weeks ago about this, about how we all need to think about how we are buying into the system and we are upholding the racist institutions ourselves, because it's in all of us. Inherently, we're all playing a role here, and we have to continue to dig down and do the work and see, where is it still living in my own body? I have to work with the fact that I have light complexion, so I have that privilege, and that's on top of all of the things that I have to deal with being a Black queer woman in this country, in this world, and there's complexities to that. So it's extremely difficult. I would say it's a lot easier to look at someone else and say, there are ways that you are upholding the system, than to look inside of yourself and have to pull apart and separate the pain from the privilege and be able to say, okay, I have my pain and I get to hold on to that, but it doesn't negate my privilege.
Yes, and I'm just gonna say, therefore, leaving me to the understanding that if we decide the most righteous and most effective act that we can do as human beings is decide to heal.
Yes.
And it's not something that it's on everybody's own timeline, right?
Yeah.
But the most effective thing that we can do for humanity,
Mm-hmm.
for us to be moving forward when we talk about even like abolition and reimagining spaces,
Yep.
is to first heal the space within inside yourself.
Doing that work, yeah.
So then you can be able to imagine something else
Absolutely.
outside of the hatred we've been indoctrinated
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
I think, you know, very much so, everyone, especially folks who are working as educators, like, you know, and I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, you all, this is why you're building a business around it. But,
Yeah.
you know, it's just a whole other conversation why this work is so important for people who think of themselves and who claim the identity of leader educator, is just like, wow, that healing has to be up front and center, because we bring all of our stuff into our classrooms,
Yes.
all of our stuff into our training spaces. And, you know, it's, as a Black student who went through the public education system, I can tell you how absolutely detrimental it was to my well-being when I had teachers who hadn't worked on their own shit, right? That affected me every day. And
still does.
Still does. And in ways that I have learned to be grateful for, because it has allowed me to realize exactly how the fuck I want to show up in when I step into a classroom.
And I think I think that's something that I want to add, DW, to what you said about everybody does it on their own timeline, they're healing. And also, we need to be healing urgently. Like, it is an urgent matter. That doesn't mean you have to rush through it, and it doesn't mean that there's a due date on it.
Right.
It means work on it as an urgent matter, because it's literally saving lives.
Yes, as if people are saying, vote as if your life depends on it, because it does.
Yes.
Heal as if your life depends on it.
Playing with y'all.
It literally does. And so I just want to say, like, I want to bring us in, because we have stuff to say today.
Yes.
And I know we're going to continue this kind of conversation.
So much more.
But it's just really just saying, just thanking you for being here, right? And offering the time and the space to be and have this conversation with us, because we know we have these conversations on a daily, and now we're just providing a space for people to have what we have, right? To experience what we experience, to come inside the house and say what up to the home, right? So we want to thank you for just taking the time and the space. And I didn't get to ask you, we didn't get to check in.
I know.
So I want to make sure that we do acknowledge this as a point of wellness, right? So I'm just going to give it a short little check-in, and then like a short little check-out as we go. Okay. So at one point this week, something that brought you joy.
Oh, yes. This week, something that brought me joy was reconnecting with a writing group. So I am part of like a graduate student of color writing group of people who are doing all work on critical race and ethnic studies. And we've been kind of each supporting each other in other ways, but of course couldn't meet together. And those weekly meeting spaces weren't just about like sharing writing, but it was a full debrief of your life since the last time you saw these folks, right? These folks are family to me. And so yesterday we met and we talked about what we need, and we talked about how to support each other. And just having those explicit conversations about investing in your own well-being, well-being and future well-being, which for me is connected to having a daily writing practice, and also being invested in hoping my other friends and family are okay. And that just kind of honest check-in meeting. Sometimes I forget how easy it is to check in on our people. And we ended up setting up, our writing together, and now we're writing multiple times a week. And it feels so good to know that I have someone who's an accountability partner, but who's someone who sees me, who believes in me, and who knows that this practice is a part of my overall well-being and has committed to showing up. And that it seemed easy. Like these things, even this, right? This showing up and sharing and being together is consistently easier than I thought, and that is bringing me so much joy.
Yes.
Word. Kinga, something that brought you joy this week?
I will say that I completed the video that I've been editing for a while now. for the youth of Black Lives Matter out here in Amherst.
Yes.
Protest in June, and we filmed a bunch of footage, and I'm not used to editing a lot of footage like that, so it took me a while to get it from the 2 hours down to 7 minutes, but it's a beautiful video, and it gave me a lot of joy to put it together and to complete it, and I'm really excited to send it out to the young people and get it out into the public. So
Yes.
Word.
And it's only because of those videos that I have been able to be connected to Black Lives Matter Amherst, which low-key makes me want to tear up because I'm just so proud. I'm such a big supporter from the middle of the fucking country.
yes.
But it's like only by sharing it will I know how to support these young people who are doing work in Amherst that myself was engaged in 2005.
Yes.
When
I think you're gonna love it. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled. I'll let you know when it comes out.
Amazing.
Right.
What about you, DW?
So something that brought me joy this week was, well, my mental space has really been, it's been really my mind has been boggled like this past week, especially with a lot of the things that have been happening, the way people have been kind of sizing me up in this way, like the way people are expecting things from me, whether that be in whiteness, whether that be in manhood, whether that be in personhood. A lot of people have been expecting a lot of things from me, and being really righteous when I decide to do for myself instead of showing up for those people. And so what has brought me joy is just deciding to do my own work and recognize that that's not going to, what is helpful for you is harmful to me. And to recognize that I'm not willing to put myself in a space of harm.
Right.
And I'm just going to go outside and sit in this chair and take up this nature and soak up this sun. And I'm going to pause everything because my harm, I'm not willing at this point, I am no longer willing to do something that is harmful to myself for anybody else.
Okay.
And so just coming to that place has been very joyful and has brought a strong sense of joy for me.
Yes.
And in closing, I want to ask you all, as we wrap, what are you taking away from us showing up today and having this space and just being with each other? What's one thing that you're taking away, maybe a feeling that may be coming up? So maybe starting with feeling, something you're taking away.
A feeling I have is just like excitement because, as I always know, one conversation unfolds to all these other conversations. And it's almost like we forget how much we have to talk about and to process.
Yes.
And I don't know about you, but I'm someone who talks to myself a lot. Like I am witnessing things and I have the desire to process. I love to talk. I love to teach.
Really?
And so I'm excited that everything is as multiplicitous as we know it is. And so this conversation is one that we needed to have to know that we are moving forward to have so many more.
Yeah.
And just excitement.
I'm feeling grounded. I feel like very grounded in all of the topics that we talked about. I just feel way more planted. I mean, it's like I have ground to stand on and to fall back onto, and it brought me back to like what I know and what is close to my heart, that like you said, we need this space to process.
Yeah.
And without being able to process it out loud and with others, I can talk about it with myself, and I do as well. But I don't get as far. You don't get as far because you don't get everybody else's perspectives that kind of help you grow onto it. So
I'm going to say I'm feeling affirmed because often I walk in the world with the feelings of being missing or erased. And having this conversation affirmed me as a human, as a person walking in this world. And so I'm very thankful. So I'm affirmed and I'm thankful for that.
Thank you both for talking. I loved it. So nice to see your faces.
Yes, you too. So I'm just going to close out and say, that was a wonderful conversation,
Yes.
a counterculture conversation with the homies.
Yes.
Stay tuned. We're coming for more. We're going to give y'all some more information, some more love, and some more goodness. And take whatever you take. And as we like to say here, whatever information you have here, make sure you apply it. You're applying it to your everyday life because you can do it. You belong, and you are most definitely
enough.